Hi YouTube, and welcome back to Sleeptime Historian. Tonight, we leave behind the crowded streets of medieval towns and travel to a lonely corner of the world where the sea never sleeps, where the wind howls through ancient stone walls, and where a single light stands between sailors and disaster. Imagine yourself on a remote coastline in the year 1368. There are no bustling markets here, no royal courts, no cheering crowds, only an endless ocean stretching into darkness and a tall stone lighthouse watching over the waves. Somewhere inside that tower lives a man few people ever think about, a man whose entire existence revolves around a flame. Every evening he climbs hundreds of stone steps, carries oil to the lantern room, cleans the glass, and prepares the light that may save countless lives before dawn arrives. It is a life of routine, responsibility, and extraordinary loneliness. Weeks may pass without a visitor. Months may go by with little conversation beyond a greeting from the occasional sailor or fisherman. While the rest of the world rushes forward, the lighthouse keeper remains, standing watch over the sea, season after season, year after year. Yet there is something strangely peaceful about such a life. Watching sunsets paint the horizon in gold, listening to distant waves crash against the rocks below, and witnessing storms powerful enough to shake the entire tower. The lighthouse keeper sees beauty and terror in equal measure. He experiences moments of complete tranquility, and nights when a single mistake could send an entire ship crashing into the cliffs. Few medieval jobs demanded such patience, such discipline, or such isolation. Tonight, we will follow the life of one medieval lighthouse keeper from his earliest days learning the trade, through violent storms and lonely winters, through years spent guiding ships safely home, and finally to the last time he would ever climb the winding staircase to light the lantern above the sea. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the sound of distant waves carry you back through the centuries, to a lonely lighthouse standing at the very edge of the medieval world, where one small flame shines against the darkness, and where tonight's story begins. The boy had never seen the sea before. Not really. He had heard countless stories about it while growing up in a small inland village far from any coastline. Travelers passing through the marketplace would speak of enormous waves taller than houses. Fishermen visiting from distant ports described storms that could last for days. Sailors returning from long voyages told stories of strange islands, dangerous reefs, and waters that stretched farther than the eye could see. Yet to the boy, these stories felt more like fairy tales than reality. His world had always been simple: fields of wheat, muddy roads, church bells ringing across the countryside, and the familiar faces of the same villagers he had known his entire life. Every day looked much like the one before it. Every season followed the same pattern. Nothing ever seemed to change, but everything changed during the spring of 1350. The old merchant who often visited the village brought news that a lighthouse keeper along the northern coast was looking for an apprentice. The position offered little money, hard work, and a life of isolation that few people would willingly choose. Most villagers laughed at the idea. Some pitied whoever accepted the job. Others said only a fool would spend his life trapped inside a tower watching ships pass by. Yet the boy felt something entirely different: curiosity. For weeks he thought about nothing else. He imagined the coastline, the ships, the storms, the mysterious tower standing above the sea. Eventually he made his decision. Leaving behind everything familiar, he joined a traveling wagon heading north toward the coast. The journey took many days, Each morning brought new landscapes. Forests gave way to rocky hills. The air gradually became colder. Stronger winds began sweeping across the roads, and with every mile, the boy felt his excitement growing. Then, late one afternoon, he heard it, a deep, distant sound unlike anything he had ever known. First he thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound continued, constant and powerful, growing louder with every step. The merchant smiled when he noticed the boy listening. "That's the sea," he said, and for the rest of the journey the boy could barely contain his excitement. Finally, they climbed a steep coastal road overlooking the cliffs below. The boy reached the top and stopped completely. Before him stretched an endless ocean, vast beyond imagination. Dark blue waters rolled toward the horizon where sea and sky seemed to become one. White waves exploded against jagged rocks below, sending sprays of water high into the air. The wind carried the scent of salt across the cliffs. Seagulls circled overhead while their cries echoed through the sky. For several minutes he simply stood there, unable to speak, unable to move. Every story he had ever heard suddenly felt too small. The ocean was bigger, louder, more beautiful than he could have imagined, and standing proudly above those cliffs, watching over the restless waters, was a tall stone lighthouse, weathered by decades of storms, silent and imposing against the evening sky. At that moment, although he could not possibly know it yet, he was looking at the place where he would spend most of his life. The closer the boy came to the lighthouse, the larger it seemed to grow. From a distance, it had appeared impressive. But standing at the base of the tower was something else entirely. The stone walls rose high above him, thick and sturdy enough to withstand the fiercest storms imaginable. Every block carried the scars of countless winters. Salt stains marked the lower stones. Moss clung to the shaded corners, and the wind seemed to whistle endlessly around the structure as though the tower itself were alive. There were no nearby houses, no busy harbor, no village streets filled with people. Only the sea, the cliffs, and the lighthouse. The isolation surprised him. He had expected at least a few neighboring buildings, but there was nothing. The lighthouse stood alone against the world, its nearest companion being the endless ocean stretching toward the horizon. As he climbed the worn stone steps leading to the entrance, he began to wonder about the man who lived here. What kind of person could spend years in such solitude? What kind of life waited behind those heavy wooden doors? Taking a deep breath, the boy knocked. Moments later, the door opened slowly. An older man stood in the doorway. His face was weathered by years of wind and sea air. His beard carried streaks of gray. His eyes seemed calm but carried the weight of countless lonely nights. This was the lighthouse keeper. For several moments, neither spoke. The keeper simply studied the boy, then stepped aside and invited him inside. The interior of the tower felt unlike any building the boy had ever entered. Narrow stone walls curved around a spiral staircase climbing endlessly upward. Lantern oil filled the air with a faint smell. The sound of distant waves echoed through the structure. Everything felt quiet, ordered, purposeful. The keeper explained the duties of the job: cleaning the lantern glass, carrying oil up hundreds of stairs, maintaining the machinery, watching the weather, recording ship movements, and above all, ensuring the light never failed. Not during storms, not during winter, not even for a single night. The work sounded exhausting, Yet the boy listened with growing fascination. That evening, he followed the keeper up the winding staircase for the first time. Higher and higher they climbed, past storage rooms, past sleeping quarters, until they finally reached the lantern room at the very top. The view stole his breath away. The sun was sinking into the sea, turning the water gold and crimson. Shadows stretched across the coastline, and ships appeared as tiny silhouettes against the horizon. Then the keeper began lighting the lantern, slowly, carefully, as though performing an ancient ritual. Minutes later, a brilliant beam of light swept across the darkening sea. The boy watched silently as the golden glow reached far into the distance. Somewhere out there, sailors would see that light and know they were safe. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unknown travelers would trust their lives to the flame burning inside this tower. And as darkness settled over the ocean, the boy realized he no longer wanted to leave. The lighthouse already felt less like a workplace and more like the beginning of a completely new life. The first morning inside the lighthouse began long before sunrise. The boy awoke to a sound he had never heard while living in the village. Not church bells, not roosters, not people beginning their daily work, but the constant roar of the ocean below. Even in sleep, the sea never seemed to rest. Waves crashed endlessly against the cliffs. Wind rattled the small windows of the tower, and somewhere above, the lantern room creaked softly as the structure settled beneath another day of storms and salt air. For a few moments, he lay still in his small room, listening, trying to remember where he was. Then the events of the previous day returned to him. The journey, the coastline, the lighthouse, the keeper, and suddenly excitement rushed through him once again. Pulling on his clothes, he hurried downstairs where the old keeper was already awake. The man seemed to operate according to a schedule older than memory itself. Every task happened at exactly the right moment. Every tool had its place. Every movement carried purpose. After a simple breakfast, the lessons began. The boy had imagined the life of a lighthouse keeper would be mostly spent watching the sea. He quickly learned how wrong he was. The tower demanded constant attention. Dust gathered everywhere. Salt coated the windows. Moisture crept into corners. The lantern glass required careful cleaning. Oil supplies had to be inspected. The stairs needed sweeping. The keeper explained that a lighthouse survived only because somebody worked endlessly to keep it functioning. Sailors far away only saw the light. They never saw the labor required to maintain it. Hour after hour, the boy followed the old man through the tower, learning where supplies were stored, learning how to inspect the lantern mechanisms, learning which sounds were normal and which could signal trouble. By afternoon, his legs already ached from climbing hundreds of stone steps. Yet, despite the exhaustion, he felt strangely happy. Every task made him feel more connected to the lighthouse, more connected to the sea. As evening approached, they climbed to the lantern room once again. The sun slowly descended toward the horizon, while the sky filled with orange and gold. Far below, fishing boats returned toward distant harbors, their sails glowing in the fading light. The keeper handed the boy a cloth and allowed him to help clean the lantern glass for the first time. It was a small responsibility, yet it felt important. For the first time, he was helping maintain the light itself, the beacon that protected countless sailors from disaster. And as darkness settled across the ocean, he realized that the lighthouse was no longer a mysterious tower on the horizon. It was becoming his home. Several weeks passed. The boy settled into the routines of lighthouse life. Each day followed a familiar pattern, yet somehow no 2 days ever felt exactly the same. The sea ensured that sometimes calm waters stretched beneath clear skies, sometimes thick fog swallowed the entire coastline, sometimes storms appeared without warning, transforming the peaceful ocean into a terrifying wilderness of wind and waves. One evening, shortly after sunset, the keeper informed the boy that he would assist with the night's watch. It was a responsibility he had been eagerly awaiting, though he tried not to show how nervous he felt. Together they climbed the spiral staircase toward the lantern room. The tower felt different at night, darker, quieter, more isolated. Every sound seemed louder after sunset. The wind outside, the distant waves below, the occasional cry of a seabird lost in the darkness. Once inside the lantern room, the boy watched the great light sweep across the ocean, again and again, casting its beam far into the night, beyond the cliffs, beyond the visible horizon. Somewhere out there ships were traveling through darkness, depending entirely upon that light. The thought filled him with both pride and fear. Hours passed slowly. The keeper occasionally pointed toward distant vessels visible as tiny lights on the water, explaining how sailors navigated, describing dangerous reefs hidden beneath the surface, sharing stories of storms and shipwrecks from years gone by. The boy listened carefully. Every story deepened his respect for the responsibility carried by lighthouse keepers. Near midnight, a thick fog began rolling across the sea. At first it appeared as little more than a pale shadow drifting over the water, but within an hour visibility had almost completely disappeared. The coastline vanished. The horizon vanished. Even the waves below became difficult to see. Only the lighthouse beam remained visible, cutting through the fog like a sword of light. The keeper remained calm, yet the boy could sense his increased focus. This was when the lighthouse mattered most. During clear weather, sailors could often navigate by stars or landmarks, but on nights like this, the light became their lifeline. The boy stood silently beside the lantern, watching the beam disappear into endless white mist. And for the first time, he truly understood why the lighthouse existed. It was more than a tower, more than a building. It was a promise that somewhere in the darkness, someone was keeping watch. Someone was guiding lost travelers safely home. And as the long night continued, the boy felt himself becoming part of that promise, one small step at a time, toward the life he would spend beside the sea. By the end of his first year at the lighthouse, the boy had begun to believe he understood the sea. He had watched calm mornings when the water looked as smooth as polished glass. He had seen thick fog drift across the coastline. He had listened to powerful winds shaking the tower during ordinary storms. Yet the old keeper often warned him about one thing. The sea always had a way of reminding people how little they truly understood. The lesson arrived on a cold autumn evening. The day had begun peacefully enough. Gray clouds hung low above the horizon, but nothing seemed unusual. Fishing boats returned to harbor before sunset. Seabirds circled the cliffs as they always did, and the lighthouse routine continued exactly as it had every day before. But shortly after nightfall, the wind changed. At first it was subtle, a distant whistle moving across the water. Then the gusts became stronger. The lantern room windows began rattling against their frames. The waves below grew larger, louder, more violent. The old keeper looked toward the horizon and frowned. He had seen this before. Without saying much, he immediately began preparing the tower. Additional oil was brought upstairs. Equipment was checked once again. Doors were secured. Windows were fastened shut. Every action was performed calmly, yet the boy could sense the urgency behind it all. Within hours, the storm arrived. Rain struck the lighthouse walls like thrown stones. Thunder rolled across the ocean. Massive waves exploded against the cliffs below with terrifying force. The entire tower seemed to tremble beneath the assault. The boy had never witnessed anything like it. Outside, the darkness appeared almost alive. Wind screamed around the stone walls. Rain lashed against the glass. And somewhere beyond the storm, ships were still fighting for survival. The keeper remained focused on the lantern. Again and again he checked the flame, ensuring the light continued sweeping across the sea despite the violence surrounding them. For the first time, the boy understood the true purpose of the lighthouse. This was not merely a job. It was a responsibility carried through fear, through exhaustion, through danger. Somewhere beyond the darkness, frightened sailors were searching for that light, trusting it with their lives, and failure was not an option. The storm continued through the night, hour after hour, refusing to weaken. The boy and the keeper remained awake long after midnight. The staircase seemed endless as they carried supplies between levels of the tower. Wind forced its way through tiny cracks in the stone walls. Rainwater appeared in places it had never appeared before. Yet the lighthouse stood firm against everything the sea could throw at it. Around midnight, while watching through the lantern room windows, the boy noticed something unusual, a faint light, barely visible through the storm. At first he thought it was lightning, but then it appeared again and again, moving slowly across the darkness. The keeper immediately recognized what it was: a ship somewhere beyond the cliffs, fighting desperately against the storm. For several minutes, both of them watched in silence. The vessel was impossible to see clearly. Only its lantern occasionally appeared between walls of rain and enormous waves. Every time the ship's light vanished, the boy feared it had been swallowed by the sea, yet somehow it continued moving, drawn toward the safety offered by the lighthouse beacon. The old keeper said very little, but his eyes never left the horizon. The boy suddenly realized that the people aboard that ship had no idea who was tending the lighthouse tonight. They did not know the keeper's name. They would never know the apprentice standing beside him. Yet their survival depended upon the work being done inside this tower. The realization filled him with a strange feeling: pride, responsibility, purpose. Long before dawn, the storm finally began losing strength. The rain weakened, the thunder drifted farther away, and little by little the ocean started calming once more. Then, just before sunrise, the distant ship emerged from the darkness, damaged but still afloat, continuing safely along the coastline. The boy watched it disappear toward the horizon, while the first light of morning painted the sea in pale shades of gold and silver. He felt different now, older somehow, wiser. The storm had taught him something no lesson ever could. A lighthouse keeper did not simply maintain a tower. He stood watch while others slept. He protected strangers he would never meet. And on the darkest nights, when the sea showed its true power, he became the difference between life and death. As the sun finally rose above the ocean, the boy looked at the lighthouse with new eyes, no longer as a curious apprentice, but as someone beginning to understand what it truly meant to keep the light burning. Months passed after the great storm. Winter arrived along the coastline with cold winds and endless gray skies. The excitement that had filled the boy during his first weeks at the lighthouse slowly began to change. The work remained important, the sea remained beautiful, but something else began creeping into his life. Loneliness. At first he barely noticed it. Each day was filled with tasks: cleaning lantern glass, carrying heavy containers of oil up the endless staircase, checking windows and doors, watching the sea from the lantern room. Yet as the weeks turned into months, he realized how isolated the lighthouse truly was. Sometimes an entire week passed without a single visitor. Occasionally a fisherman would stop by with supplies, or a merchant vessel would signal from the sea. But most days there was nobody, no crowded streets, no conversations in village markets, no laughter from neighbors, only the wind, the waves, and the old keeper. Even their conversations were often brief. The keeper was not unfriendly. He simply belonged to a generation that had learned to live with silence. Hours could pass between words. Sometimes they would share a meal together while listening to the storm outside, neither speaking, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet. At first the boy found this strange. Back in his village, silence often felt uncomfortable. Here it became something different, a companion. Yet there were nights when the loneliness felt heavier than usual. Standing alone in the lantern room, watching darkness stretch endlessly across the ocean, he sometimes wondered what his old friends were doing, whether anyone remembered him, whether his family still talked about the boy who had left home to live beside the sea. On those nights, the lighthouse seemed larger, the ocean seemed wider, and the distance between himself and the rest of the world felt impossible to measure. Still, every evening he climbed the stairs, lit the lantern, and continued his work, because slowly, without fully realizing it, the lighthouse was becoming part of him, and he was becoming part of the lighthouse. One cold evening near the end of winter, the boy was standing in the lantern room shortly before sunset. The sea was unusually calm that day. Gentle waves rolled toward the cliffs below. The sky glowed with pale shades of orange and gold, and for the first time in weeks, the wind had almost disappeared completely. The old keeper was downstairs repairing equipment, leaving the boy alone with the view. As he stared across the water, something caught his attention: a ship far away on the horizon, barely visible in the fading light. At first it seemed like any other vessel, yet he found himself watching it for a long time, wondering where it had come from, wondering where it was going. Somewhere aboard that ship were sailors with stories of distant kingdoms, foreign ports, new adventures, places he would likely never see. For several minutes he imagined what life might be like beyond the lighthouse, traveling across oceans, visiting strange cities, seeing wonders hidden beyond the horizon. The possibilities felt endless. Yet as the ship continued its journey, a strange realization settled over him. He did not actually wish to leave. The thought surprised him. Months earlier he would have jumped at the opportunity, but now something had changed. The lighthouse no longer felt like a temporary stop along the way, felt like home. The sea, the cliffs, the endless routine, even the loneliness had become familiar. The ship eventually disappeared into the growing darkness, the sails fading beyond sight, and as the first stars appeared overhead, the boy climbed the final steps to the lantern room. He carefully lit the great beacon once more, watching its golden light sweep across the water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Strangers would see that light tonight. They would never know his name, never know the sacrifices made to keep it burning, yet they would trust it, just as countless sailors had trusted it before. And standing high above the sea, listening to the distant crash of waves against stone, the boy felt something he had never felt before, a quiet sense of belonging, as though the lighthouse had chosen him just as much as he had chosen the lighthouse. The following winter brought a challenge unlike storms, unlike towering waves, unlike anything the boy had faced before. Fog, thick, endless, relentless fog. It arrived quietly one evening shortly after sunset, rolling across the ocean like a pale ghost. At first, neither the boy nor the keeper thought much of it. Fog was common along the coast. Usually it arrived during the night and disappeared by morning, but this fog stayed, day after day, week after week. The world beyond the lighthouse seemed to vanish. The cliffs disappeared. The horizon disappeared. Even the sea itself became invisible beneath a blanket of white mist. Standing at the lantern room window felt like staring into nothingness. Sometimes the boy could barely see beyond the tower walls. The isolation grew even deeper than before. On clear days, he could at least watch ships crossing the horizon, observe fishermen returning home, follow distant storms moving across the water. But now there was nothing, only whiteness stretching endlessly in every direction. The lighthouse beam became more important than ever. Every evening they carefully prepared the lantern, ensuring the glass remained spotless, ensuring the flame burned perfectly, because somewhere beyond the fog, unseen sailors depended upon that light. The boy often found himself wondering about those ships. Were they frightened, lost, struggling to navigate through the mist? He would never know. Yet every night he climbed the staircase with renewed determination, knowing that even though he could not see the people relying on the lighthouse, they were out there, searching for its glow through the darkness, through the fog, through the uncertainty of the sea. The work became repetitive, almost endless, yet it also taught him patience. The ocean moved according to its own rules. Nature cared little for human plans. Some days were bright and beautiful, others disappeared beneath mist for weeks at a time, and the lighthouse keeper's duty remained unchanged. Keep the light burning, no matter what. One evening, while the fog remained at its thickest, the boy heard something unusual, a sound drifting across the water, faint at first, almost impossible to distinguish from the wind. Then it came again, a deep metallic tone echoing through the mist. The keeper immediately recognized it. A ship's bell, somewhere nearby, far closer than any vessel should have been. Both of them rushed to the lantern room windows, yet there was nothing to see, only fog pressing against the glass. The sound came again, louder this time. The ship was moving blindly through dangerous waters, unable to see the coastline, unable to see the cliffs hidden beneath the mist. For several tense moments, the boy felt his heart racing. The vessel could be carrying dozens of sailors, perhaps even families, merchants, travelers, all trusting that somewhere nearby a lighthouse keeper was watching over them. The keeper remained calm as always. He adjusted the lantern, checked the flame once more, then instructed the boy to listen carefully. Again the bell rang through the fog, this time slightly farther away. Then again, and again. Gradually the sound began moving in the correct direction, following the lighthouse beam back towards safer waters. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. the bell growing weaker each time it echoed across the sea, until eventually it disappeared completely. Silence returned, the fog remained, yet both knew the danger had passed. Somewhere out there, unseen faces continued their journey because the lighthouse had done its job. The boy stood quietly beside the lantern as midnight approached, realizing something important. Most people would never know about moments like this. There would be no celebration, no reward, no recognition. The sailors would continue their voyage. The lighthouse would continue its watch, and tomorrow would look much like today. Yet perhaps that was what made the work meaningful. Helping people who would never know your name, standing guard while the rest of the world slept, keeping a promise made by generations of lighthouse keepers long before he was born. As the great beam swept across the endless fog once more, the boy looked out into the darkness and felt himself becoming less of an apprentice and more of a true keeper of the light. Several years had passed since the boy first arrived at the lighthouse. He was no longer the wide-eyed apprentice who had stood speechless before the sea. The ocean had changed him, the endless routines had changed him, and the lighthouse itself had become woven into the rhythm of his life. By now he could predict storms before they arrived. He could identify distant ships simply by their silhouettes. He knew every stone of the tower, every creak of the wooden floors, every sound made by the lantern during the night. Yet despite all he had learned, the sea still possessed the power to surprise him. One autumn evening, a violent storm swept across the coastline without warning. Dark clouds swallowed the sky before sunset. The wind howled around the tower, and waves rose higher than anything he had seen in years. The old keeper and his apprentice, who was no longer truly an apprentice, worked tirelessly to keep the lighthouse operating. Oil levels were checked. Lantern glass was cleaned repeatedly. Every precaution was taken. Then, sometime after midnight, a flash of lightning illuminated the ocean for only a second, but it was enough. Far below the cliffs, a ship appeared. The vessel was far too close to shore, tossed helplessly between enormous waves. The young keeper rushed to the window, his heart pounding. Another flash of lightning revealed the ship once more. This time he could see sailors running across the deck, fighting desperately against the storm. The keeper beside him remained silent. There was nothing they could do except keep the light burning. Minute after minute, they watched the terrible struggle unfold. Then came a sound neither would ever forget. Even above the wind, even above the crashing waves, they heard the cracking of wood. The ship had struck the rocks. The sea immediately swallowed it. Another flash of lightning revealed fragments of the vessel scattered among the waves below. Then darkness returned. The young keeper stood frozen, listening to the storm, realizing that somewhere out their lives had been lost. People with families, dreams, stories, all gone in a matter of moments. And for the remainder of the night, he never once left the lantern room, watching the sea, hoping for survivors, praying the storm would spare at least a few. By dawn, the storm had finally passed. The ocean remained rough, but the terrible winds had faded. Gray clouds drifted slowly across the sky while sunlight struggled to break through. The coastline looked different after every major storm. Pieces of driftwood littered the beaches below. New scars appeared on the cliffs. The sea always left evidence of its power. Yet this morning felt different. He knew why. Together the keeper and his apprentice descended the cliff path leading toward the shoreline. The air smelled of salt and wet stone. Waves continued rolling against the rocks as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the sea had not claimed an entire ship only hours earlier. Scattered across the beach were fragments of wreckage, broken planks, pieces of rope, shattered barrels, the remains of a vessel that had once crossed oceans. The young keeper walked among the debris in silence, occasionally stopping to examine objects carried ashore by the waves. A wooden chest, part of a mast, a sailor's boot. Each item served as a reminder that real people had stood aboard that ship not long ago. Real people who had trusted the sea and lost everything. As the morning continued, they discovered signs that gave them hope. Footprints in the sand, evidence that at least some sailors had survived and reached shore during the night. The realization brought relief. The ocean had been merciless, but not entirely without mercy. Returning to the lighthouse later that afternoon, the young keeper climbed to the lantern room and looked out across the water. The horizon appeared calm once more, peaceful even, yet he understood now that beneath its beauty the sea possessed incredible power, could provide life, could create livelihoods, could connect distant kingdoms, but it could also take everything away in a single night. From that day forward, whenever he lit the lantern at sunset, he thought not only about guiding ships safely home, he thought about the sailors who never made it, the unseen faces lost beyond the waves, and the responsibility carried by every keeper of the light, because somewhere out there, another storm was always waiting, and when it arrived, the lighthouse would once again stand between hope and disaster. The years passed more quickly than the young keeper expected. Seasons arrived and disappeared with almost frightening speed. One winter blended into the next. Storms came and went. Ships appeared on the horizon and vanished once more into distant waters. The lighthouse remained unchanged, standing proudly above the cliffs as it had for generations. By now the keeper was no longer a boy. He had grown into a man of nearly 30 years. The sea air had hardened his features. Long days climbing the tower had strengthened his body, and countless nights watching over the ocean had given him a patience few others possessed. Yet the greatest change was not physical. It was the silence. Over time, he had become accustomed to a level of solitude most people would find unbearable. Entire weeks passed without visitors. Sometimes months went by without meaningful conversation beyond a few words exchanged with fishermen delivering supplies. There were mornings when he would stand outside the lighthouse and realize he had not heard another human voice in days. Yet strangely, he no longer feared the loneliness. The sea had become his companion. The cries of seabirds felt familiar. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below was as comforting as music. He knew the coastline better than anyone alive. Every rock, every hidden reef, every dangerous current. Sometimes he would sit beside the lantern room window long after sunrise, watching distant ships sail across the horizon, wondering about the lives of the people aboard. They traveled from kingdom to kingdom, visited bustling ports, met strangers from distant lands, while he remained in the same tower year after year. Yet he never felt envy, because those sailors belonged to the sea only temporarily. He belonged to it completely. The lighthouse was no longer simply where he worked. It had become who he was. One cold evening, while carrying supplies up the tower staircase, the keeper noticed a group of fishermen approaching from the shoreline below. Visitors were rare enough to attract his attention immediately. As they climbed the path toward the lighthouse, he recognized several familiar faces. Men he had occasionally seen over the years. Their boats had passed the coast countless times. Their families lived in villages scattered along the shoreline. After greeting him respectfully, the fisherman shared stories from nearby ports, stories he found difficult to believe at first. Apparently, sailors across the region had begun speaking about the lighthouse and the man who tended it. Many younger sailors knew nothing about his name. Some had never even seen him, yet they all knew the light. During storms, they spoke of it almost like a guardian watching over the coast. Older captains told stories of nights when the lighthouse had guided them safely home through impossible weather. Some even referred to the keeper as the man in the tower, a figure who seemed to exist outside ordinary life, always there, always watching, always keeping the lantern burning. The fisherman laughed while telling the stories, yet the keeper felt strangely uncomfortable hearing them. He had never thought of himself as important. He had simply done his duty every day. One lantern, one staircase, one night at a time. Still, as the fisherman departed and darkness settled across the sea, he found himself reflecting on their words. Somewhere beyond the horizon were sailors who trusted a light they had never seen up close. Men who believed someone would always be waiting atop the cliffs, guiding them through darkness. The realization filled him with quiet pride. Not pride in himself, but pride in the responsibility he carried. As night fell, he climbed the familiar staircase once more, step after step, just as he had done thousands of times before. Reaching the lantern room, he lit the great beacon and watched its golden light sweep across the ocean. Somewhere far away, a sailor would see that glow tonight. Perhaps they would whisper a prayer of thanks. Perhaps they would never think about it at all. It did not matter. The keeper smiled softly as the beam crossed the dark waters, because regardless of whether anyone remembered his name, the light would continue shining, and that was enough. The winter of 1371 arrived earlier than anyone expected, even before autumn had fully disappeared. Icy winds began sweeping across the coastline. Dark clouds gathered above the sea almost every day, and the lighthouse keeper found himself facing one of the harshest seasons of his life. By now, he was nearly 40 years old. The young apprentice who had once climbed the tower with excitement existed only in memory. His beard had grown longer. Threads of gray had begun appearing among the darker hairs. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes. Yet each evening he still climbed the spiral staircase carrying oil for the lantern, still checked every window, still watched over the sea exactly as he had done for decades. The ocean itself seemed different that winter, colder, more hostile, more determined to test both sailors and lighthouse keepers alike. Massive waves struck the cliffs day after day. The wind screamed around the tower through long nights that seemed to last forever. Sometimes snow mixed with sea spray and covered the lighthouse walls in ice. On the worst evenings, visibility dropped so low that even the beam of the lantern struggled to pierce the darkness. Yet no matter how terrible the weather became, the keeper refused to let the light fail. There were nights when he slept only a few hours, nights spent carrying extra fuel upstairs, nights spent clearing ice from windows while freezing winds cut through his clothes. He often wondered how many sailors were staring toward the coastline at that exact moment, searching desperately for the glow of the lighthouse, depending upon a man they would never meet, a man standing alone atop a tower at the edge of the world, and somehow Despite the exhaustion, despite the loneliness, despite the years, he never stopped feeling the importance of that responsibility. Late one evening during that endless winter, the keeper noticed something unusual from the lantern room. 3 separate ships appeared on the horizon, their tiny lights flickering against the darkness. Such a sight was rare during winter storms. Most captains avoided these waters whenever possible. Yet, for whatever reason, the vessels had continued their journeys despite the dangerous conditions. The keeper watched them carefully as the weather began worsening once again. Clouds rolled across the sky, rain lashed against the glass, and powerful winds swept over the ocean. Soon the ships became little more than distant shadows, occasionally visible when lightning illuminated the sea, then disappearing once more into darkness. For hours he remained at his post, refusing to look away. The lighthouse beam continued sweeping across the water, again and again, cutting through rain and mist, offering the only reliable guide available to those sailors. Around midnight the storm reached its peak. Thunder shook the tower. Waves crashed against the cliffs below with tremendous force. Yet somehow the 3 ships continued moving, following the light, fighting toward safer waters. The keeper felt a strange connection to them, though he could not see the faces aboard. He imagined frightened sailors gripping ropes, captains shouting orders into the wind, men placing their trust in a beacon shining from the distant shoreline. Then, slowly, hour by hour, the storm began weakening, the rain eased, the clouds broke apart, and one by one the ships emerged from the darkness. Safe, damaged perhaps, exhausted certainly, but alive. The keeper watched until the final vessel disappeared beyond the horizon shortly after dawn. A small smile crossed his face. No crowds would celebrate this victory. No one would write songs about it. Yet somewhere in distant ports, hundreds of sailors would return home because a light had remained burning through the storm. And as the first sunlight touched the ocean, the keeper stood beside the lantern and realized something remarkable. He had spent half his life watching over the sea. Years measured not by calendars, but by storms survived, ships guided, and nights spent keeping the darkness at bay. The lighthouse was no longer simply his home. It had become his legacy. The years continued to pass, almost without notice. One season faded into the next. One storm followed another, until eventually the lighthouse keeper realized he was no longer a young man. The sea had taken much from him over the decades. It had weathered his face, turned much of his beard gray, filled his memories with countless nights of wind and rain. Yet it had also given him purpose. A purpose that had lasted nearly his entire life. The old keeper who had first welcomed him to the lighthouse was long gone now, buried in a small cemetery overlooking the coast. His apprentice had become his successor, and now, for the first time, he found himself training a young newcomer of his own. The sight felt strangely familiar. The young apprentice reminded him of himself many years earlier, curious, energetic, filled with questions about ships and storms and distant lands beyond the horizon. Sometimes while teaching the boy how to maintain the lantern, the keeper caught himself repeating the same advice he had once received decades ago. The sea is never your friend. Respect every storm. Never trust calm water completely, and above all, never allow the light to fail. One cold evening, after climbing the tower stairs for what felt like the 1000th time, the keeper paused halfway to catch his breath. something he had never needed to do in his younger years. His legs ached, his joints felt stiff, the staircase seemed steeper than before. For the first time, he understood a truth he had spent years ignoring. His own journey was slowly approaching its end. The lighthouse would survive without him. The sea would continue long after he was gone. New keepers would climb these stairs. New sailors would follow the beacon through darkness. And life would move forward exactly as it always had. The realization saddened him, yet it also brought a strange peace, because he had given the lighthouse everything he had. And perhaps that was enough. A few weeks later, during a calm evening near the end of spring, the keeper stood in the lantern room watching the sunset spread across the ocean. Golden light reflected upon the waves, transforming the sea into a shimmering field of fire. It was one of those rare evenings when the world felt perfectly still. No storms, no fog, no danger, just the sea breathing quietly beneath the fading sky. Then something caught his eye, a large merchant vessel approaching from the south. At first it seemed ordinary, yet as it drew closer, he noticed the captain signaling toward the lighthouse. Shortly after sunset, a small boat left the ship and approached the shore below. Curious, the keeper descended the tower and walked toward the landing area, waiting beside the cliffs. When the visitor finally arrived, he found himself facing an elderly sailor with silver hair and weathered skin. The stranger smiled warmly before speaking, and then told a story the keeper had almost forgotten. Decades earlier, during a terrible storm, his ship had nearly been destroyed along this very coastline. He and dozens of others had survived because they followed the lighthouse beacon through darkness, because someone inside the tower had kept the light burning through the night. The sailor explained that he had never forgotten it. For years he had hoped to return and thank the keeper personally. The old lighthouse keeper listened quietly, looking out toward the ocean as memories flooded back. The storm, the lightning, the distant ship struggling against the waves. A moment he had believed forgotten by everyone except himself. Yet here stood a man whose entire life had been changed because of that single night. As darkness settled across the coastline, the two old men sat together overlooking the sea, sharing stories while the lighthouse beam swept across the water behind them. And for the first time in many years, the keeper realized something important. The light had done more than guide ships. It had touched lives he would never fully know, lives scattered across distant ports and distant kingdoms, people who had carried a small piece of the lighthouse with them long after sailing away. And as the stars appeared above the horizon, the keeper felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for recognition, not for praise, but simply for having spent his life doing something that mattered. However quietly, however invisibly, it had mattered all the same. The autumn of 1385 arrived with an uneasy feeling in the air. The lighthouse keeper was now approaching 50 years of age. His beard had become heavily streaked with gray. The years had left their mark upon him, yet every evening he still climbed the spiral staircase carrying oil to the lantern room, still watched the horizon with the same dedication he had shown as a boy. The young apprentice now handled much of the physical work, but the keeper continued to oversee every detail. Old habits formed over decades were difficult to abandon. One evening, shortly before sunset, he noticed something troubling. The sea had become strangely calm, too calm. The sky above the horizon carried an unusual color, dark clouds gathering far in the distance. Even the seabirds seemed restless, flying inland long before nightfall. The keeper had seen signs like these before, many years ago, before some of the worst storms of his life. Without wasting time, he and his apprentice began preparing the lighthouse. Extra oil was brought upstairs. Windows were secured. Emergency supplies were checked. Every precaution was taken. Then the storm arrived, stronger than anything they had experienced in years. Wind battered the tower walls with incredible force. Rain struck the glass in endless sheets. Waves exploded against the cliffs below like thunder. The apprentice struggled to hide his fear, yet the keeper remained calm. Years of experience guided every decision, every action, every movement. Throughout the night, they fought to keep the lantern burning. Again and again, the keeper climbed the staircase despite his age and exhaustion, refusing to leave anything to chance. At one point, a powerful gust shook the tower so violently that the apprentice feared the lantern room windows might shatter. But the old keeper simply adjusted the flame and continued working, as though he had become part of the lighthouse itself, a living extension of the tower. By dawn, the storm finally began to weaken. The sea slowly surrendered its fury, and once again the lighthouse remained standing, victorious against another assault from the ocean, perhaps its greatest victory yet. A few days after the storm, the keeper found himself standing alone in the lantern room shortly before sunset. The ocean below appeared calm once again. Golden light reflected across the water, creating a scene almost impossible to reconcile with the violence of the previous week. For a long time, he simply stood there, looking out at the horizon, remembering. He remembered arriving as a frightened 14-year-old boy. He remembered meeting the old keeper who had changed his life. He remembered storms, shipwrecks, endless winters, countless sunsets, decades spent watching over sailors he would never meet. Every memory seemed to live within these stone walls. Every staircase step carried a story. Yet one truth had become impossible to ignore. His time as keeper was approaching its end. Later that evening, he invited the apprentice to join him in the lantern room. Together they watched darkness settle across the sea. The apprentice expected another lesson about weather, navigation, or lighthouse maintenance. Instead, the keeper handed him the lantern tools he had used for most of his life, tools worn smooth by decades of work. For several moments, neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Both understood the meaning of the gesture. Eventually, the keeper smiled and looked toward the horizon, explaining that a lighthouse was never truly owned by any one person. Each keeper merely protected it for a time, then passed the responsibility to the next generation, just as the old keeper had once done for him, and now he would do the same. The apprentice listened quietly while the great beacon swept across the sea, again and again, illuminating the darkness exactly as it had done for generations. The keeper felt a deep sense of peace. The lighthouse would survive. The light would continue shining. Long after he was gone, sailors would still find their way home. Storms would still come and go. And somewhere in the future, another young apprentice would climb these stairs for the first time, looking out across the endless ocean with wonder in his eyes, just as he once had so many years ago. The winter of 1392 would become the last winter of the keeper's long career, although he did not know it at the time. Something felt different about the season from the very beginning. The winds seemed colder, the stairs seemed steeper, and the years suddenly felt heavier than ever before. The keeper was now an old man. His beard had turned almost completely white. Deep lines marked his face. His hands carried the scars of decades spent working among stone, iron, salt, and storms, yet every evening, without fail, he still climbed the lighthouse staircase, one step at a time, slowly now, far slower than in his youth, but with the same determination he had carried for nearly 40 years. The apprentice had become a skilled keeper in his own right, strong, capable, respected by sailors along the coast. Yet the old man continued joining him each night, not because he was needed, but because the lighthouse was woven into every part of his life. It was impossible to imagine existing without it. One particularly cold evening, snow drifted across the coastline while the sea below churned beneath dark clouds. The keeper stood beside the lantern room window watching the waves crash against the cliffs. He had seen this view thousands of times, tens of thousands perhaps, yet somehow it still filled him with wonder. Memories returned as he watched the storm. The first time he had climbed these stairs, the first storm he had survived, the ships guided safely through darkness, the friends he had lost, the sailors he had saved without ever knowing their names. Entire decades seemed to pass before his eyes while the lantern continued its endless sweep across the water. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine the lighthouse after he was gone, the apprentice lighting the beacon, new generations of sailors following its glow, future keepers standing where he now stood, watching the same sea, listening to the same wind, carrying the same responsibility. The thought no longer saddened him. Instead, it brought comfort, because the lighthouse had never belonged to him. He had merely been its guardian for a little while. Several weeks later, a rare calm evening settled over the coast. The sea was unusually peaceful, the wind almost completely absent, and the sky glowed with colors so beautiful that even the old keeper found himself standing silently in admiration. Gold, orange, crimson, every color reflected across the ocean until the water appeared to be made of liquid fire. The apprentice was completing the evening preparations when he noticed the old keeper sitting outside the lighthouse for the first time in years, not working, not checking equipment, simply watching the sunset. Together they sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the cliffs, neither speaking very much. There was no need. The old man seemed lost in thought, looking toward the horizon where sea and sky met in the distance. After a long silence, he finally spoke, not about storms, not about lighthouse duties, but about life. He talked about arriving as a frightened boy many decades earlier, about how small the world had seemed back then, about all the things he had expected from life, and all the things he had never expected at all. He admitted that there had been moments of loneliness, moments when he wondered whether he had chosen the right path. Yet looking back now, he would not change a single thing. Every storm, every sleepless night, every difficult winter had led him here, to this quiet evening overlooking the sea he loved. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, the lighthouse cast a long shadow across the cliffs. The old keeper watched until the final sliver of light vanished beneath the water. Then he smiled softly, the kind of smile worn by someone who knows his journey is nearing its end, but who feels no regret, only gratitude. Behind them, the lantern room awaited, ready for another night of watchkeeping. Yet deep inside, both men understood something. The apprentice would soon become the keeper, and the keeper, after a lifetime spent guiding others through darkness, was preparing for his own final voyage. The spring of 1393 arrived quietly. The storms of winter had finally passed. The sea had become calm once more, and the lighthouse stood exactly as it always had, watching over the coastline from its lonely cliff. Yet for the old keeper, everything felt different. He was now an old man nearing the end of a life spent beside the ocean. His beard was completely white, his movements slower than ever before. Even climbing the familiar staircase had become difficult. Each step required effort. Each journey to the lantern room reminded him how many years had passed. On a cool evening shortly before sunset, he made the climb one final time, alone. The apprentice offered to help, but the old keeper politely refused. Some journeys needed to be taken by oneself. Slowly he ascended the spiral staircase, touching the worn stone walls as he climbed. The same walls he had known for more than 40 years. Every step carried a memory. Every turn of the staircase reminded him of another chapter in his life. At last he reached the lantern room. The sea stretched endlessly before him, calm and peaceful beneath a sky painted gold by the setting sun. For a long time he simply stood there watching the horizon, remembering everything: the frightened boy arriving at the coast for the first time, the old keeper who had welcomed him, the storms, the fog, the shipwrecks, the sailors saved by a light they would never fully understand. Entire decades passed through his thoughts while evening slowly settled across the water. Then, with steady hands, he prepared the lantern one final time, carefully cleaning the glass, checking the flame, performing every task exactly as he had done thousands of times before. When darkness finally arrived, the great beacon came to life, sweeping across the sea. One last night, one last watch, one last promise kept. The old keeper sat beside the lantern room window throughout the night, listening to the waves below, watching stars appear above the ocean. And as midnight passed, he felt a peace unlike anything he had ever known. The lighthouse no longer needed him. The apprentice was ready. The light would continue shining. The sea would continue breathing. And somewhere beyond the horizon, countless journeys would continue long after his own had ended. Several days later, the old keeper passed away peacefully in his sleep, inside the small room he had called home for most of his life. There was no storm, no tragedy, no dramatic final moment, only silence, the same quiet that had accompanied him through decades of lighthouse keeping. News spread slowly along the coastline. Fishermen lowered their heads when they heard. Sailors arriving in nearby ports spoke respectfully of the man who had watched over the sea for so many years. Many had never met him, yet somehow they felt they knew him, because for decades his light had guided them through darkness. A few days later, a small funeral was held overlooking the ocean. The sea was calm. Gentle waves rolled against the cliffs below. The apprentice stood among the gathered mourners while church bells echoed across the coastline. Nearby rested the old keeper's grave, facing the ocean he had loved throughout his life, facing the horizon he had spent thousands of nights watching. As sunset approached, the ceremony ended, people slowly departed, and silence returned to the cliffs. For a moment, the apprentice remained alone beside the grave, looking toward the lighthouse standing proudly above the sea. Then, as evening shadows lengthened, he turned and began walking toward the tower, The same path the old keeper had followed countless times before. The same stone staircase awaited him, the same lantern room, the same responsibility. Step by step, he climbed upward until he reached the beacon. Outside, darkness spread across the ocean. Ships moved across distant waters. Sailors searched the horizon, and just as they had for generations, they waited for the light. The apprentice smiled softly and lit the lantern. A warm golden beam swept across the sea, cutting through the darkness, guiding strangers safely home. The old keeper was gone, yet his legacy remained, because lighthouses are not remembered for the men who tend them. They are remembered for the light they leave behind. And far out upon the endless ocean, the beacon continued shining, just as it always would. Long after every keeper had become part of history, the sea rolled endlessly against the cliffs below. The stars filled the night sky above, and somewhere in the darkness, another story was already beginning. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us on this journey through the lonely life of a medieval lighthouse keeper. Until next time, good night, and may the light always guide you safely home.